In 1995, a school bus carrying 5 young children, their dedicated teacher, and a beloved driver vanished from a quiet Detroit street. In the vacuum of their absence, the police constructed a simple, cruel narrative. The driver, a black man named Isaac Davenport, had snapped, kidnapping his passengers and becoming a fugitive. For 29 years, that lie was the only story, a tale of betrayal that poisoned a family's name and buried a horrifying truth. The real story, however, lay dormant, sealed in rust and silence, waiting for a single moment of chance to bring it all back to light. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. For Isaac Davenport, an autumn Tuesday in 1995 was supposed to be like any other. At 42, he was a fixture in his Detroit neighborhood, the trusted driver of bus number 12 for the North Star Academy, a small charter school in a working-class black community. His gentle smile and steady hands were a comforting presence for 2 generations of school children. This wasn't just a job for Isaac, it was a calling. He knew the kids not by their designated stops, but by their dreams, their fears, the superheroes they drew in their notebooks. He was more than a driver. He was a confidant, a protector, a familiar anchor in their daily lives. His daughter, 14-year-old Kenya, idolized him. She saw the quiet dignity in the way he polished his bus's mirrors each morning, the pride he took in a job many considered thankless. He was her hero, a man whose integrity was as solid as the Michigan steel that had built their city. She knew he was on his final, special route of the day, the late bus, taking a small group of students home from an advanced arts and sciences after-school program. On board bus number 12 that afternoon were 5 children, their minds still buzzing with creativity. Among them was 9-year-old Omar Bakery, a bright, energetic boy with a sketchbook always in hand. Chaperoning them was Ms. Valerie Sinclair, a passionate and protective teacher in her mid-30s, known for her dedication to her students. The route was simple, a winding path through quiet residential streets that Isaac could have driven with his eyes closed. The bus was last seen on the public record by a traffic camera at 4:15 p.m., making a routine right turn onto a side street lined with aging maple trees. It was a perfectly ordinary moment, a yellow school bus on a quiet autumn afternoon, disappearing around a corner. But it never reappeared. At 5 p.m., when the bus was 30 minutes late to its first scheduled drop-off, the school began making calls. By 5:30 p.m., the first frantic parents, including Omar Bakeries, were on the phone with each other, a cold knot of dread tightening in their chests. By 6 p.m., the Detroit Police Department had been notified. For Kenya Davenport, the nightmare began with a phone call to her home from Omar's mother. "Kenya, is your daddy home yet?" He never dropped off Omar. Kenya's own mother had passed away a few years prior, leaving a close bond between father and daughter. She knew her father's schedule intimately. He was never, ever late without calling. A wave of cold fear washed over her. She called his pager. No response. She called his bus dispatch radio, a line usually crackling with chatter, now met with an unnerving silence. By nightfall, the full, terrifying reality had set in. A school bus, carrying 5 children and 2 adults, had vanished from the face of the earth. The initial police response was a mix of confusion and procedural action. Patrol cars began to slowly canvass the route, their searchlights cutting sterile beams across empty streets and quiet houses. But there was nothing to see. No accident scene, no broken glass, no skid marks, no sign of a struggle. The bus, a massive, unmissable yellow vehicle, had simply evaporated into the fabric of the city. Kenya and the families of the other missing children and Ms. Sinclair gathered at North Star Academy. The school's brightly lit gymnasium transformed into a makeshift command center of grief and fear. The parents clutched photos of their children, their faces pale masks of disbelief. Kenya held a photo of her father, a proud man standing beside his bus, his arms slung protectively over her shoulder from a few years earlier. The hours ticked by with no news. The police took statements, their questions feeling hollow and inadequate in the face of such an impossible event. How could a school bus, a 40-foot-long vessel of bright yellow steel, just disappear? The question hung in the air, a testament to a mystery that felt less like a crime and more like a tear in the fabric of reality. For Kenya, the night was a blur of hushed, panicked conversations, of holding the hands of other crying children, of staring at her father's photo and refusing to believe the unthinkable. Her hero, the steadiest man she knew, was gone. And as the first long night of their collective nightmare began, she had no way of knowing that the city's official version of the truth would soon become a separate, more insidious kind of violence, a lie that would haunt her family and defile her father's name for the next 29 years. The disappearance of North Star Academy's bus number 12 should have triggered one of the most massive, urgent manhunts in Detroit's history. A school bus, a teacher, and a group of children vanished. The premise was so horrifying, so fundamentally wrong, that it seemed to demand an overwhelming response. For the first 48 hours, it appeared that it would. The story was the lead on every local news channel. The mayor held a grim press conference, and police officials assured the public that every possible resource was being deployed. But for the families, and especially for 14-year-old Kenya Davenport, the chasm between the public pronouncements and the private reality of the investigation quickly became apparent. The search was vast, but unfocused. With no last known location beyond that final turn, and no ransom demand to provide a clue, the police were chasing a ghost. The investigation, led by a pair of overworked and cynical homicide detectives, began to drift, seeking a simple narrative to explain an impossibly complex event. They found one in Isaac Davenport. To the investigators, a black man from a working-class neighborhood at the center of a baffling crime was not treated as a victim, but as a convenient variable. The narrative began to shift, not with a sudden accusation, but through a slow, toxic drip of suggestion and insinuation. Isaac, the beloved driver, was reframed. He was a man with some minor financial debts, they discovered. He had argued with the dispatcher a month earlier over a scheduling change. He was a single father. These mundane details of a normal life were meticulously collected and twisted into the sinister portrait of a man under pressure, a man about to break. Kenya and her grandmother were subjected to hours of questioning that felt less like an inquiry and more like an interrogation. Did your father ever seem angry, Kenya? Depressed? Did he ever talk about wanting to get away from it all? The questions were laden with implication, designed to mold the image of a man on the edge, a man capable of snapping. My father loved his job, Kenya insisted, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and teenage fury. He loved those kids. He would never hurt anyone. But her words, the words of a distraught child, were dismissed as naive loyalty. The families of the missing students, initially united in their shared terror, began to receive quiet, off-the-record suggestions from detectives. We're looking into the driver's background. There might be more to this story than it seems. The seed of suspicion, once planted, began to sprout, fracturing the community's unified grief. It was easier for the city to digest the idea of a troubled man kidnapping a bus than to face the terrifying alternative that a professional, organized, and violent entity could operate so flawlessly within their city, making a 40-foot bus and its occupants disappear without a trace. Blaming the victim was easier. It contained the horror. The official search for the bus wound down after 2 weeks. The story moved off the front page. The police department, in a final press conference on the case, announced that while the search for the children continued, the primary focus of their investigation had shifted. Isaac Davenport was no longer being treated as a missing person. He was now officially named as the sole suspect in the abduction of the teacher and children, a fugitive from justice. The announcement was a public execution of Isaac's character. His smiling face on the missing posters was replaced with a grim, mugshot-style photo on the news, the cheering underneath reading, "Wanted, Isaac Davenport." For Kenya, this was a second, more profound kind of vanishing. First, she had lost her father. Now, the world had stolen his good name, replacing the hero she knew with a monster of their own making. Her family was shattered. The sympathy from the community curdled into suspicion. She was no longer the daughter of a beloved, missing man. She was the daughter of a fugitive kidnapper. The weight of that lie was unbearable. She became isolated, her grief compounded by a burning, helpless anger. The case of the phantom school bus went cold, but the official story was set in stone, a convenient fiction for the city to believe. For 29 years, Kenya Davenport would carry the dual burden of a lost father and a stolen legacy. Her fight for his vindication a lonely, silent war. The years that followed the official branding of Isaac Davenport as a fugitive were a long, slow erosion of hope for his daughter, Kenya. The world, it seemed, had accepted the police department's tidy narrative. Isaac was the villain, a man who had snapped, a ghost story used to scare new bus drivers. The children and Ms. Sinclair were his tragic, silent victims, their faces fading from public memory, their cases effectively closed, subsumed into the larger, more convenient file of their supposed kidnapper. Kenya grew up fast. At 14, she had been forced to defend her father's character to neighbors who now averted their eyes. At 16, she was spending her nights in the library, not studying for school, but reading law books, trying to understand how a system could so thoroughly and callously erase a good man. The injustice of it all forged her into the woman she would become. Sharp, relentless, and deeply distrustful of authority. She pursued a career not in law. The courtroom felt like a place of performance, not truth, but as a paralegal for a small, tenacious firm that specialized in wrongful conviction cases. It was a choice born from her own family's tragedy. She spent her days poring over case files, looking for inconsistencies, for the single thread that, when pulled, could unravel an official lie. Every case she worked on was a proxy battle, a fight for the justice her own father had been denied. Her personal life was one of quiet solitude. The trauma of 1995 had left her wary, guarded. She maintained a small circle of trusted friends who knew her story and respected her ongoing, quiet fight. She never married, never had children. How could she, when the world had shown her how easily a family could be torn apart, how quickly a loved one could be not just lost, but vilified? For 29 years, her father's case was her shadow. She wrote letters to a succession of police chiefs, mayors, and investigative journalists, pleading with them to re-examine the evidence. Most went unanswered. The few replies were form letters, polite dismissals citing the lack of new evidence. The case was closed. Isaac Davenport was a fugitive. That was the end of the story. But for Kenya, it was never the end. She became an amateur archivist of the tragedy. On a secure hard drive, she kept digitized copies of every news article, police statement, and photo. She tracked the original detectives, noting their retirements. She followed the slow, sad dissolution of the other families, the divorces, the moves, the quiet surrenders to a grief that had no resolution. The suspicion cast upon her father had been a poison, preventing the families from uniting in a common cause. By 2024, Kenya Davenport was 43. She was a respected paralegal, a woman known for her sharp mind and tireless work ethic. To her colleagues, she was a private, dedicated professional. Few knew about the ghost that drove her. The hope of finding her father alive had faded long ago. What remained was a single, hard, unwavering goal: to clear her father's name. She had resigned herself to the fact that she would likely carry this fight to her own grave. The system had built its wall of lies too high, too thick. She had no idea that just a few miles away, on the industrial outskirts of her own city, a veteran crane operator was about to lift a rusted, forgotten piece of the past into the sky, and in doing so, provide the single, explosive piece of new evidence she had spent her entire adult life waiting for. The Detroit United Scrapyard was a sprawling, metallic graveyard where the city's discarded history came to die. Mountains of rusted cars, twisted rebar, and forgotten industrial machinery baked under the autumn sun, waiting their turn to be fed into the maw of the crusher. A massive hydraulic press that could flatten a sedan into a pancake in under a minute. For scrap, Johnson, a man in his 50s who had operated the yard's main crane for longer than he could remember, it was just another Tuesday. His job was a rhythm of noise and force. The groan of the crane's engine, the satisfying clang of the massive electromagnet latching onto a vehicle, the final, shuddering crunch of the press. He worked with a practiced, almost bored efficiency. That afternoon, his next target was a pathetic-looking old school bus, dragged in on a flatbed from a recently cleared, long-abandoned industrial property on the city's outskirts. It was a ghost from another era, its iconic yellow paint faded to a sickly ochre, pocked with rust and grime. Its windows were shattered, its tires long since rotted away. It was just another piece of junk, number 73 on his daily manifest. Scrap maneuvered the crane, the powerful electromagnet descending and locking onto the bus's roof with a resounding clang. He lifted it effortlessly, the rusted hulk swaying gently in the air as he swung it over towards the crusher's platform. He was on autopilot, his mind already on his lunch break. He positioned the bus over the platform, released the magnet, and watched as it settled into place with a heavy, final-sounding thud. He retreated to the crane's control booth, his hand reaching for the large, red button that would begin the crushing sequence. He pressed the button. The hydraulic arms of the massive press began their slow, inexorable descent. It was in that moment, as the shadow of the descending plate fell across the bus, that something caught his eye. A piece of rusted paneling on the side of the bus, loosened by the rough handling, had fallen away, revealing a small, protected section of the interior wall that had been shielded from the elements for decades. On that small patch of faded yellow, something was taped. It was a child's drawing. A simple, crayon rendering of a bright yellow sun with a smiling face, the kind of art that adorned a million classroom walls. Scrap's hand, hovering over the controls, froze. He squinted. A kid's drawing. On a school bus. Normal enough. But this bus, it felt different. It was old. It had been hidden somewhere for a very, very long time. There was a story here, he thought, a sad one. He thought of his own grandchildren, of the drawings they taped to his refrigerator. A sudden, inexplicable instinct, a gut feeling honed by decades of seeing the discarded remnants of people's lives, screamed at him. His hand shot out and slammed the massive, red emergency stop button. With a loud hiss of hydraulic pressure, the crusher plate shuddered to a halt, inches from the bus's roof. The sudden silence was deafening. Scrap climbed down from his control booth, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. He walked over to the bus, peering through a shattered window at the drawing. It was just a simple sun, but in that moment, it felt like a message, a small, defiant flicker of life in a tomb of rust. He knew the protocol. Unidentified vehicles, especially ones that seemed out of place, were supposed to be checked. This one had come in on a bulk lot, its VIN likely unlogged, destined for scrap without a second thought. But that drawing, it wasn't right. Acting on a gut feeling he couldn't fully explain, he walked back to his booth, picked up his radio, and called his yard manager. "Boss," he said, his voice gruff. "You better get down here. That old school bus, the one we're about to crush, there's something not right about it. I think maybe we should call someone before this thing disappears for good." The yard manager, initially annoyed at the delay, came down to look. He saw the drawing, saw the look on Scrap's face, and agreed. It was probably nothing. But in a city like Detroit, a city full of ghosts and forgotten stories, you never knew. An hour later, a single Detroit Police Department patrol car, responding to a non-urgent call about a suspicious derelict vehicle, pulled into the scrapyard, its arrival the first, quiet step in reopening a 29-year-old wound and unearthing a crime that a city had long tried to forget. The initial police response to the call from the Detroit United Scrapyard was lukewarm. A derelict bus was hardly a priority. But when the first responding officers ran the barely legible vehicle identification number, a flag, dormant for nearly 3 decades, blinked to life on their in-car computer system. The bus was officially listed as evidence in a major unsolved case from 1995, the disappearance of North Star Academy's bus number 12. The call went up the chain of command, and within hours, the scrapyard was transformed. The rhythmic clang of metal was replaced by the quiet, focused intensity of a major crime scene investigation. Detective Ben Lawson of the Detroit PD's cold case unit arrived, his mind racing. He was a sharp, modern detective in his early 40s, and he knew the legend of the Phantom Bus, a case so cold it was practically myth. His first call was to a number he found deep in the old digital file, a number that had been called countless times in the 90s with no new information. It belonged to Isaac Davenport. When he told her they had found her father's bus, there was a long, shattered silence on the other end of the line, followed by a single, whispered "Where?" At the scrapyard, Detective Lawson and his forensic team, with Kenya now present and observing from a distance with a victim advocate, began the painstaking process of examining the rusted hulk. The bus was a tomb, sealed by time and grime. They carefully documented everything, from the child's drawing of a son that Scrap Johnson had spotted, to the layers of rust and decay. The initial sweep of the main cabin was both heartbreaking and baffling. They found remnants of a life interrupted, a small, discarded hair ribbon, a faded comic book half buried in debris, a petrified sandwich in a brown paper bag. But there were no human remains. The children were not here. This discovery brought a fresh wave of agony. If they weren't on the bus, then where were they? But the forensic team noticed something strange. The floor of the bus, towards the rear, was not uniform. A section of the heavy-duty rubber matting seemed newer, or at least differently worn, and beneath it, the metal floor showed signs of having been cut and re-welded. It was a crude but effective modification, almost invisible under the grime. Detective Lawson ordered a section of the floor to be carefully cut away. As the powerful saw buzzed through the metal, a new, horrifying space was revealed beneath. It was a hidden, shallow compartment, not more than 2 feet deep, running the width of the bus. It had been expertly welded shut. The team used heavy tools to pry open the sealed metal plate. A wave of cold, stale air escaped. The contents were wrapped in thick, oil-stained tarps. A forensic technician, his face grim, carefully pulled back the first layer. The silence in the scrapyard was absolute. Inside were the remains of 2 adults. One, a man, showed signs of a violent struggle and a fatal injury consistent with blunt force trauma. His work uniform, though decayed, was identifiable as that of a city bus driver. The other, a woman, appeared to have suffered a similar fate. They had been hidden here in this secret, welded coffin for 29 years. Later, dental records would confirm what everyone already suspected. The remains were those of Isaac Davenport, the bus driver, and Ms. Valerie Sinclair, the teacher's chaperone. The discovery was a brutal, seismic shift in the case. Isaac Davenport was not a fugitive kidnapper. He was a hero, the first victim, who had clearly fought his hijackers and been murdered for his resistance. Ms. Sinclair had died with him, likely trying to protect her students. Isaac Davenport, watching from a distance, finally let out the sob she had held back for hours, a sound of both profound grief for her father's brutal end and a fierce, vindicating love. His name was finally, undeniably, cleared. But the horror was compounded by a new, more terrifying mystery. The children, including 9-year-old Omar Bakery, were not in the hidden compartment. They were not on the bus at all. The hijackers had murdered the 2 adults who could protect them, and then taken the 5 children somewhere else. The mystery had just become much larger and much more sinister. The discovery that Isaac Davenport and Valerie Sinclair had been murdered, their bodies hidden within the very bus they were last seen in, transformed the 29-year-old mystery into a high-priority double homicide investigation. Isaac, the long-accused villain, was now officially recognized as the first victim, a hero who had died trying to protect his charges. For his daughter, Kenya, this public vindication was a profound, seismic relief, the first ray of light in a lifetime of shadow. But it was immediately eclipsed by a darker, more complex question. If her father was a victim, what had happened to the children? And why would anyone go to such lengths to hijack a school bus? Detective Ben Lawson, with Isaac Davenport as a now official consultant to the investigation, began to look at the case not as a simple abduction, but as a piece of a much larger, more sophisticated criminal puzzle. They focused on the anomalies found on the bus, the chemical traces, the bullet casing, the expert welding of the hidden compartment. These were not the hallmarks of a lone, deranged kidnapper. This was professional. Kenya, using her paralegal skills, dove into the city archives for 1995, searching for other major, unsolved crimes that occurred in the same narrow window of time as the bus's disappearance. She cross-referenced old police reports, newspaper articles, and court documents. And then she found it. A story that had dominated headlines for weeks in late 1995 before it, too, went cold. The audacious, multi-million-dollar heist of a Federal Reserve transport truck. The details of the heist were legendary. A professional crew had ambushed the armored truck on a city overpass. The crime was meticulously planned, but the getaway was what had baffled investigators for decades. Witnesses had reported seeing the heavily armed robbers transfer cash into a waiting vehicle, but the descriptions were chaotic and contradictory. One strange, dismissed witness account mentioned seeing them transfer bags into what looked like a beat-up yellow school bus that had pulled up at the scene with impossible timing. At the time, the police had discounted it as absurd. A school bus as a getaway vehicle? It was too conspicuous, too illogical. Suddenly, it was the only thing that made sense. Detective Lawson's team re-examined the evidence from the bus in this new light. The chemical traces found on the floor were consistent with residue from dye packs used in bank money bags. The high-caliber bullet casing matched the type used by one of the known suspects in the heist, a man who had been questioned but never charged. The phantom bus from the heist and Isaac Davenport's missing bus number 12 were one and the same. The new theory was chillingly clear. A notorious crew of professional thieves had planned the heist of a lifetime and needed a perfect, unassuming getaway vehicle. They hijacked Isaac Davenport's bus, a soft target on a quiet route. They murdered Isaac and Ms. Sinclair to eliminate witnesses and gain control of the vehicle. They then used the bus, a symbol of childhood innocence, as a Trojan horse to transport their stolen millions, driving away from the heist scene unnoticed in a vehicle no one would ever suspect. The investigation now had names, faces from the old heist file. They were career criminals, now old men in their 70s, living quiet lives on fortunes they had stolen 3 decades ago. Detective Lawson's team began to build a new case, connecting the old heist to the new murder evidence. They tracked down the surviving members of the crew. The climax was the arrest of the aging ringleader, a man who had lived a life of quiet luxury, his great crime a source of local legend, but never proven. Faced with the new forensic links from the bus and the reopened murder investigation, and perhaps a confession from a less hardened member of his old crew, the wall of silence finally crumbled. He admitted to the heist, to the hijacking, to the murders of Isaac and Valerie. But when Detective Lawson and Kenya asked him the final, agonizing question, "What did you do with the 5 children?" the old man's face was a mask of cold indifference. "Leverage," he rasped. "We took him with us after the job, just for a while, to make sure no one followed too close. Dropped him off a day later, out of state, on a quiet road. Gave him some cash, told him to walk to the nearest town. What happened to him after that? Not my problem. They were just loose ends." The confession was a final, brutal blow. The children hadn't been the targets. They had been disposable tools, human shields in a heist, then cast aside hundreds of miles from home. Their ultimate fates remained unknown, a new, tragic mystery born from the solution of the old one. The surviving members of the heist crew were convicted for the murders of Isaac Davenport and Valerie Sinclair. Their life sentences a cold comfort for a lifetime of pain. Isaac's name was publicly, heroically, cleared. A memorial was erected at the new North Star Academy in his and Ms. Sinclair's honor. Kenya Davenport stood at the memorial dedication, her long fight for her father's vindication finally over. She had cleared his name, had seen his killers brought to justice. But the victory fell hollow, incomplete. The story of the children, of Omar Bakery and the others, remained unfinished. They were still out there, their fates unknown, their families still waiting. The story ends with Kenya, having won her father's battle, quietly beginning a new, even more difficult one. dedicating her life and resources to the search for the 5 lost children of bus number 12, a new chapter in a long, heartbreaking struggle.